Our next speaker is Joseph Boling. Joseph has been a member of ONS for over 50 years. His discovery of the notes he will be talking about today led to a collaboration with Professor Kazuya Fujita at Michigan State University to locate and translate a Japanese website that explains their significance.
All right, we're going to be talking about what happened in 1972 when Okinawa reverted back to Japanese suzerainty or sovereignty. The U.S. and allies invaded Okinawa in April 1945, and after a couple of months of very hard fighting, pushed the Japanese out of Okinawa. And when the war ended and the treaty was signed, Okinawa remained under U.S. trusteeship for another 20 years. The treaty was signed in 1952. It wasn't until 1972 that Okinawa actually reverted back to Japanese control. So during that period, here's what was going on with the circulating currency. We brought in the Allied military currency when we first invaded Japan, and that was for use by the troops in the local economy, and it was a supplemental currency. We didn't replace the Japanese yen that were in use with the Allied military currency. It was used alongside it, which means that the only Japanese who ever actually saw it were the merchants and bar owners and whatever that were right outside the gates. And of course, while the war was going on, there wasn't much of that going on either. But at that time, troops were being paid in the currency of the country they were in. So we had to have a form of Japanese currency to pay them with, and that was what we were using the Allied military yen for. In 1946, the homeland converted under MacArthur's occupation to a new series of yen. All the wartime notes and pre-war notes and denominations higher than 1 yen were converted to all new notes. On Okinawa in 1948, all of that yen was converted back into the Allied military currency. Since we were controlling Okinawa, apparently our Allied military government there wanted to have better control over the currency, so they used AMC for the entire population. But GIs were using military payment certificates by that time. So we had the two currencies circulating side by side, but the Japanese were not using the same currency that was being used on the mainland. They were using the AMC. When I keep saying Okinawa, I'm actually talking about the entire Ryukyu Reto, the entire chain of Ryukyu Islands, Okinawa being by far the principal one. In 1958, the Allied military currency was withdrawn and everybody converted to U.S. greenbacks. So all the Japanese were using U.S. currency on Okinawa from 1958 until 1972. In 72, we actually started talking about this reversion in 71. It took several months to get the actual transfer of government treaties to be composed and signed and agreed to by everybody. The Japanese realized, okay, now all these folks in Ryukyus who are using greenbacks are going to have the homeland currency again. And something weird had happened in the world in that period. The Nixon shock, the oil embargo, the decoupling of the US dollar from gold. It meant that the US dollar started to fall in value against the yen. The yen to dollar ratio had been 360 yen to the dollar ever since 1949. Now suddenly it was 330 yen to the dollar. This meant that all those Japanese who were going to have to convert back to yen were going to lose money in the conversion over what they would have had if the conversion had happened while it was still at 360. So there were a lot of folks in Okinawa that were irritated about losing 10% of their wealth in this currency conversion. And they complained to the government. The government decided, all right, we will make up the difference. When the reversion actually occurs and you have to buy yen with your dollars, the rate will be at the then prevailing rate. But the day they announced that that would happen, they said, oh, now, by the way, you're going to have to register your dollar cash holdings tomorrow. Overnight, they had to implement a system of having everybody bring all their cash in and have it recorded so that they would know when the reversion occurred how many dollars these folks had. It wouldn't give them an opportunity to have almost a year while all these negotiations were going on to go out and acquire more dollars so that they could have a windfall exchange. So here was what the Allied military yen looked like. This was the new yen that was circulating up in the mainland. This is one denomination. It's the 5 yen denomination. It happens to be a misprinted or a badly printed note with wrinkles all in the paper. It just happens to be the only one that I had a picture of. And this is what was actually circulating on Okinawa at the period. 1950 series, 1963 series, 1969 series, greenbacks. This is what they had to use the next day, the day after the announcement was made. They had to register their dollars on this form, and when the reversion took place, that would be the amount of dollars they could convert at the favorable exchange rate. Now, this person had only two $10 bills for a total of $20. And this certificate never got turned in after the reversion because the number of yen he was going to pick up for $20, 600 yen, was only $2 or $3. And he just never bothered to go in and convert use that $20 credit to convert it at the new rate. Now, this up here is a postage stamp that's been converted to use as a validation seal. It's a national park commemorative for the Iriomote National Park, which is in Ryukyus. It's a Ryukyus stamp. During this U.S. trusteeship, the Ryukyus had their own series of stamps. They weren't using Japanese homeland stamps. But it got converted to be used as a validation sticker on these forms because nobody would have these handy. They wouldn't be able to go out and reproduce the form and bring in something later that was a fraudulent statement of what their cash holdings were on the day that this registration took place. This rubber stamp, you notice, has a character missing here. The character is celebrate. And what this said was celebrate reversion and then Ryukyu government down here, Ryukyu Seifu. Well, some Japanese objected to the celebration part. They said, what's to celebrate? You know, the Ryukyus have been Japanese forever, or at least, well, yeah, a long time. And we shouldn't be celebrating the fact that we're finally getting Ryukyus back as we should have had them when the occupation ended. Others, I mean, there's all kinds of stories about why this character was removed, but overnight, these stamps that had been prepared for this registration day had to be modified by carving off that character. Now, on registration day, those same postage stamps were supposed to be applied to every registered note, so the note couldn't be re-registered. You couldn't register your cash, take it back home, and then give it to your neighbor and let him go in and register the same cash. Well, the Americans that were going to get these dollars back in the Treasury didn't want them all cluttered up with those stamps, so they objected. And then that oval stamp that you just saw was going to be used on the registered notes, and the Americans complained about that too for reasons I don't understand. So in the end, they just used pencil erasers. And you can see here that you got a triangular one, a square one, a round one. And over here, another round one, a square one, a triangular one, all different colors. Whatever was handy was used to mark the notes as they were registered to prevent them from being registered a second time. Now, anybody can make a note look like this if he, picks the right series and properly circulated grades and goes and finds a rubber stamp. So unless you have a provenance that links these back to the period, there's no premium attached to notes that are so marked. And that provenance is difficult to establish at this date and time. These were the notes that were going to be used to exchange the dollars for yen. The 500 and 1,000, these are the two that were circulating. The 5,000 and 10,000 were the two that still had Shotoku Taichi's portrait on them, Prince Shotoku. 2 years ago at the ANA convention in Rosemont, a friend of mine from California brought in a binder of Hansatsu that he wanted me to go through and identify and give him some ideas of what values he had. And he said, and I also have these other weird things that were in this same collection. A bunch of these notes, and he had 7 of these, which he sold me at face value. One now is with Professor Fujita up in Michigan, and I still have these 6. And he had these 2 yen notes with the ZZ block. And he thought they might be replacements. Some countries do use the Z block as a replacement indicator. I knew immediately that they were not replacements because I know the Japanese have no easily discernible replacement indicator for their notes, not like the asterisk that we put on ours, which we call a star note. But I took these notes and sent them up to Kazuya and said, what do you know about these ZZ block notes? I didn't have the foresight to photograph these 2 pieces individually before I sent them off to him. This is a picture that he made after he got them. It turns out that he already had a 500 yen with a ZZ block, and he'd done some research on it. He said, you know what? There's a guy in Japan, his name is Suzuki, Wasaburo Suzuki, who has done all down in the weeds research on Japanese post-war currency to the individual block level. And he has identified a series of blocks, which he calls outliers. They don't tie in with the progression of blocks from that particular printer in that period. And he has identified those as the ones that were used at the Okinawa Reversion. Well, the Japanese government did not even admit that they had used a special series of notes for the reversion conversion until decades later. Finally, a Showa finance history published and buried deep in it, Kazuya found a reference to special notes were printed for the reversion conversion, but they didn't identify how they were special, just that they were different. Well, Suzuki has identified a series of blocks which he asserts were in fact the conversion. And the fact that these 2 notes and these other 6 notes back here all came from, together in this collection is further evidence to me that these, in fact, were reversion-related blocks. So Suzuki has done a lot of work on these and identified all kinds of blocks that are of interest. There's a close-up of the 500. There's a close-up of the 1,000. Now at the Pittsburgh ANA, just past ANA, I was looking for these. I wanted to see, if you could find them in the wild. And because I collect counterfeit paper money, I always go to a foreign exchange dealer at the end of every ANA convention and look through all the foreign exchange which he has bought at that convention so I can get low-grade notes to go with my low-grade counterfeits to teach with. When I teach counterfeit detection, I want the good note and the bad note to be in the same condition side by side so the students can see that even an ugly looking genuine note can be separated from an ugly looking counterfeit if you know what you're looking at. So I was going through his foreign exchange and this popped out of it, and it's a YZ block. So I pulled out my copy of the manuscript from Fujita, and here's the block table from that manuscript. It's going to be published in the IBNS Journal coming up next issue or the issue after that. And buried down here under 1,000 yen notes, there's that block, Yankee Zulu Mike. That's the block on the note which I had found in this foreign exchange dealer's miscellaneous stuff that he'd bought at face value to exchange back, to the homeland. So I spent $7 for this note. I was delighted to have it. And it's the first one that we found outside these first two with the two ZZs that came from the collection in California. So you notice that not very many 500s were done, not very many 5,000s were done. A whole ton of 1,000s were done, and quite a few of the 10,000s were done. The blocks, the trailing character identifies the print plant. All of these outlying blocks that Suzuki identified came from a single print plant, the Odawara print plant. And their identification letters are Romeo, well, actually Juliet through Romeo, J through R, skipping O. They never use the O as a printer indicator. So only these trailing letters could come from that print plant. So they used all the ZZs with all their trailing letters, and then they started again with the YZs with their trailing letters, and didn't need to print all the way to the end. You notice down here at the 10,000s, the blocks are constructed differently. These are all the Romeo print plant identifier, and it's the block that changes, starting with Sierra, Tango, STU, V, W, X, Y, Z. It's pretty obvious that they printed them in reverse order. They started with the ZZs and printed in that direction. And the YZs, or the Z, yeah, where's the Y? Oh, it was 1,000 up here. The YZ was in the last block that they printed for the thousands. All of these blocks are 900,000 notes apiece. The Japanese never print to 1,000,000 because they don't want to deal with the having a 7-digit 1,000,000 or having it roll over 000, 6 zeros. And as I said, they don't have a star note to stick in there. So they stop every block at 900,000. So you can figure out how many were printed here. All of these blocks were printed in full, except for the 5,000s. They printed 500,000 of this one and 100,000 of that one for 1,000,000 notes. All these others were 900,000 per block.
Thank you very much, Joseph. That was a really interesting talk. I know nothing about notes. I always learn a lot when I hear you talk. So it's great to hear.